line weight. It's one of those things that a lot of us struggle with when it comes to line work. I was definitely no exception. I felt like one of the biggest problems for me was actually putting too much emphasis everywhere to the point that my line work would feel very clunky and heavy. And on top of that as well, I felt like I wouldn't even know what the line weight was supposed to represent. So in other words, it was hard for me to really make any meaningful decisions from it. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down the different aspects that you can emphasize with line weight and how you can manipulate and play around with that in order to direct your viewer's eye to creating interest, contrast, and emphasizing certain artistic qualities within your piece. So hope you guys enjoy the video. Take this design for example that I've done for JTuff Design Jam quite a few months ago. This was the stage of the line work without any line weight put on it. And here's an example where I added more line weight. As you can see, there's certain areas that are a little bit heavier with it that create some emphasis, and as a result, this contrast actually draws your attention as well. So one of the things that you can represent with line weight is shadows. And typically lighting comes from the top, right? Whether it's from the sun or maybe it's from a lamp above. And I know that there's circumstances where it comes from the bottom, but for the most part, it stands to reason to assume that most lighting is going to come from the top. So as a result, shadow is going to be cast on the other side that the lighting cannot hit, which in this case would be the underside. So typically, I like to emphasize the undersides of objects. So you can see me doing that from the roof over here, the awning, even under the door frame and the windows as well. But on top of that as well, I represent ambient occlusion as well. So what ambient occlusion is essentially when two objects are very close to one another or touching. So in this very simple example of me bringing my hands closer together, it's forming a darker line. So essentially wherever objects are touching one another or very close to touching one another, there's going to be this deeper and darker line. And I choose to represent that, for example, where the roof meets the house over here, and also where the house meets the ground as well. And what that does is essentially gives the building a little bit of a weight to it, where it feels like it's grounded rather than something that's as floaty. And you can represent shadows as deep and as dark as you want it to be. So, for example, you can have much heavier cast shadows that are created by the objects that are kind of overhanging something else, such as the roof over these frames, or maybe even the underside, you completely make it dark, and any place that creates like a hole or a tunnel, such as these windows or doors, and leading into the house, you can make it completely dark. I know that this might be a bit too heavy for some people, but it certainly lends itself better to certain kinds of looks, such as graphic novels or even manga and things like that. I personally am a fan of this, but I can understand if some people aren't. And I also like to create these extra shapes as well in order to just create a little bit more distinction, because once again, line weight creates emphasis and contrast as well. So by adding these extra shapes, I'm just trying to show that this awning is a little bit further out, and actually there's a distinction of depth between these objects. And you can see me doing it for the chimneys as well. I think it'll be very helpful for us to actually look at different examples of how different artists employ line weight, and of course specifically with the shadows being represented by line weight. I personally am a fan of Ryo Yambe over here, and you can see how when this roof is touching this wall over here, it's creating emphasis with a darker line, but also where the head kind of juts out a little bit as well. There's this darker cast shadow that's being created, and with the ornamentation as well. And that just helps create a bit of distinction and makes it feel like there's a little bit more form to it as well. And you can see it on the underside of the leaves too. And I think it's even more prominent with this image, with the emphasis that's the heaviest around the robotic arm here and on the table. And you're gonna get lighter line weight emphasis for the shadows as it fades further out. So keep this in mind when you're doing line weight. Try not to have this equal emphasis throughout. When you do that, everything starts to feel really heavy. And just to illustrate that, for example, let's just say I applied the same line weight throughout, like here, then here, and here. As you can see, it starts to compete a little bit with the table on the front. Even here as well. And here, here, here. As you can see, it kind of dilutes the statement of the line weight in the middle. So in essence, yes, logically speaking, you might get all of these shadows and ambient occlusion elsewhere, but keep in mind that line weight in a sense is going to be depending on your intention. And as long as you keep in mind that line weight creates this emphasis, choose to put it where you want people to look and de-emphasize it where you don't want them to look. And I cannot emphasize that enough myself. And another one of my favorite artists to look at when it comes to line weight and even architectural sketching is Hendros. And you can see he has a preference for very heavy shadows being represented by line weight, where you can see this heavy shadow on the underside of the roof and the underside of this structure that juts out a little bit, and it's literally representing cast shadows. And even here as well, since these parts of the structures are really hanging out more, it's therefore creating this darker shadow or ambient occlusion where not much light can reach. And once again, this might not be your cup of tea, but I personally love it, as I feel like it really creates this really bold and graphic composition, and there's like a nice play of like different shapes of shadows and all of that. But at the same time, I know that some people prefer their line weight a little bit more delicate and light. But as long as you know what you can choose to represent with line weight, you can then adjust it according to your liking. And lastly, one of the most influential pieces that I think made me fall in love with this kind of heavier and graphic shadows kind of line weight style is by an artist called Oscar Cafaro. And you can see that even for objects further in the background, it's basically a pure silhouette. And all of these things that are the interior are dark, the underside, and even the far frame of this crane as well. So this can be used as a way to de-emphasize things too. So rather than spending a lot of time really detailing out the interiors or even the canisters in the back, you can kind of just create a silhouette from it. Another thing you can represent with line weight is depth. So with these examples, there's no changes that are being made by line weight just yet. However, when I choose to emphasize the parts of the design and the shapes that are closer to us, you can see now that there is a distinction. The objects that are closer are heavier and darker, and the ones that are further away are lighter. So I have to give a shout out here to one of my best buds, Thomas Chamberlain Keane, or better known as TCK, for his amazing use of line weight with his Inktober series that he did a while back. And you can see that even within the same object itself, with this cockpit or this steel frame here, you can see that the ones that are closer to us have heavier emphasis, and the frame that is receding away from us is lighter. And you can probably even see a little bit of a combination with some of the ambient occlusion and shadows that I was talking about, because line weight, it's not that it's working separately or that you just have to choose one. You're actually going to combine it together. And of course, that will depend on your preference, just how much of these you combine and how much you emphasize each one. But in this case, you can see that even with the curves over here as well, with it being closer to us, you can see a very heavy emphasis, and you can see it emphasizes the forms as well. And we'll get to that later. And for even the strap as well, for the scuba tank, you can see that the ones that are closer to us gets the heavier emphasis. And with this image, you can very clearly see the objects that are further away, like this vehicle over here, because it's far back in the distance, it's lighter line weight. And for the body over here as well, and the character and all the elements on it, they're much thicker. And even within the character itself, there's a bit of a hierarchy. So maybe the fins and the hips over here that are closer to us is still going to be the heaviest. But for some of the objects that are a little bit further away, maybe such as this part of the tube as well, might be a bit thinner. And you can even see it as well here for the Dumbo octopus as well, where the form that is furthest away is going to be the lightest. And of course, got to give a little bit of a shout out to moi as well, myself, where you can see me taking cues and actually being inspired by Thomas with the objects that are much closer to us, such as the grooves on the shell here being much deeper than the ones on the back. And you can see me combining it with a little bit of the ambient occlusion and the shadow line weight as well, such as the underside of the counter. But of course, with the objects here being much thicker in line weight, if you really think about it. So even if I take a snippet here and drag it all the way here, you can see a big difference in terms of how thick the line weight is. And of course, I did that purposefully to show you guys the distinction of depth. Sometimes you might be in a bit of a rush, or you might not really have the time to actually create all these subtle fall off of line weight. And what I mean by that is, let's just say you have an object like so, like you have multiple objects here, and there's some objects that are further in the background over here. Maybe if you're lacking in time, or if you have the time more like it, you might actually create a distinction of depth by doing the emphasis on all of the objects first, not caring too much about all of these interior lines. But when you have the time, then you can kind of cause it to taper off a little bit. And even here as well. Basically adding some subtlety. However, if you are lacking in time, then what you might end up doing is just emphasizing the exterior, almost like a toon shader of sorts that you sometimes see in games, the cell shaded style. Or you might treat it almost like cardboard boxes. So rather than doing all of the gentle distinctions between all the forms here, so where it gets darker, it gradually fades as it gets towards the interior, and treating individual objects as separate, and making sure that there's a distinction of depth even within such a small part of the composition. This is ideal. I'd even do it for the bushes, the fences, and all of that too. However, because of the scale of the piece and how much I've already spent on it, I only did it around the main parts of the object. So you can see that I didn't really do much distinction within the ships itself, within the docks, and I treated most major objects kind of like cardboard cutouts. And sometimes that's what you need to do. Ideally, we'd have the time to put all this artistry and subtlety, but hey, sometimes deadlines gotta be met, right? All right, another one as well, and the last one that we'll cover today is going to be form quality. So what I mean by that is there's some forms that are going to be rounder than others, and there's going to be some forms that are sharper than others. So what you want to do is actually emphasize the quality of those forms. So here I emphasize the sharpness of certain objects, such as the tips here, but at the same time emphasizing the roundness of certain objects by making the part where it's the roundest extra emphasized with line weight. And here are some beautiful examples by Claire Wendling. You can see basically where at some parts of the tiger here, there is emphasis. This is probably like a really bony bit of the tiger. that kind of juts out, but it's emphasized by the line weight here as well. And even the kinks and the crooks of the tails as well, some of it is being emphasized a little bit deeper in some parts here. And even here as well on the underside where it's a bit rounded. And look at all of those varieties and variations. And look at all of these variations on the tiger's paw as well. So rather than doing it as one flat line like this, where it feels very chunky and unrefined, there's almost different tapers just to show that there's some parts that probably stick out more and some parts that recede, and it just makes it feel much more dynamic and interesting. And you can see it here as well, even here. This one's much lighter, but you can see the emphasis done for this divot over here, and even the roundness of the thigh here or the butt, even with the neck here as well, and even with the snout and all of that. And you can see that there's actually pretty heavy emphasis around the head, but as it goes further out, where you can say it's less important, or at least where she doesn't want to bring too much heavy emphasis, it remains quite light. So don't be afraid to take those creative liberties to actually de-emphasize it where you just don't want to, despite logic telling you that it should be there. This is where you need to make that decision. And of course, another example from me, because why not? So you can see me creating the emphasis of roundness on the muscles of the dragon here as well. But at the same time, the parts that are kind of sticking out bony, I decided to emphasize it a little bit more here as well. And this is a bit more rounded. This is a little bit sharper as well, where I emphasized it a bit. And of course, you can see the combination of like ambient occlusion as well, and the shadow on the stool over here, but the roundness of the bubble here as well of the neck, you can see a big emphasis here, and combined with shadow too, of course. So once again, everything's just kind of working together, and there's different aspects you can emphasize with line weight. So let's actually apply all of the things that we've learned here and see how we can actually do it on some proper designs. And I'm going to be showing you how I'm going to apply all of this line work live. And feel free to also follow along as well. Or if you have access to the PSDs as well, by all means, try to do it by yourself first, or maybe even see how I do it and try and implement it in the same way. All right, now that we've covered all the things that we can actually play around with, let's actually see how we can implement it onto some actual designs. All right, so for the house over here, one of the first things that I actually really like to do is to emphasize the underside first. And I'll actually do the line weight on a different layer. So I'm just going to make my brush slightly bigger than the original size of the line work. And the thing is, with the line weight as well, or the initial line work, should I say, I decided to do all of it with one size. And maybe if I'm doing it for myself, I would not necessarily do that. But for the sake of the demo, and even from when I was learning, I actually find that keeping it the same size at least helps me to not create emphasis where I don't want it to be. Especially when you're zoomed in and you're getting lost in the sauce and all of the details. It's actually very easy to just not think about the overall picture. However, when you actually do the line weight on a separate layer and you're also gradually building it up, you can then slowly decide whether you've done too much emphasis on one area or maybe you haven't done enough. So in other words, it's easier for you to actually assess and in a way, just turn off the layer or begin erasing if you feel like it's too much. So for example, I can even just do something like this, right? If I'm not happy with it. But if you've done everything on one layer, then good luck. And I'm going to keep it relatively light here. And I know I've been talking about the idea of doing heavier ambient occlusion, but even then, I still like to start it light. And I'm just focusing on the underside and the edges facing away from the light, gradually building it up. And you can see that right now it's already creating that emphasis on certain parts. and it's creating distinction, which is very important. So for these kinds of things as well, if I want to apply roundedness to it, maybe I'm going to make it thicker in the middle here as well and have it gradually taper out. So you can definitely apply a lot more subtlety to it with your line weight, making sure that there's some taper, some that are going thicker as well. But if you're not as confident about the control of your line weight or your line work in general, then maybe it's okay to kind of just focus on the same width throughout. But as you get more experience, you definitely want to be able to maximize and try to achieve these kinds of subtleties that push your piece to the next level. So I like to do this here as well. Actually, let's still start on the underside. I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead here, but even here as well. I might actually make some of the bricks thicker, some thinner, just to show that maybe some bricks are a little bit deeper, some a little bit more shallow. So this creates some variety. So it's almost creating this boop, boop, boop. So it makes it feel like the bricks are irregular rather than all being the same. But of course, sometimes if you're rushed for time, just do one big consistent weight. But it does make it look more bland. So I like to try to take a little bit of time here when I can. So here, size here as well. All right, gotta discipline myself from getting a little bit too far ahead, which tends to be a problem with me here as well. So focus on just underside first. And I like approaching line weight this way because it really makes me mindful about what exactly I'm doing. And especially when I was starting off, I just felt like it was too easy to overdo it. And I like to start off with the major forms as well, but at a certain point, I'm definitely going to think about the individual objects, such as the tiles over here. And once again, maybe some of it has thicker line weight and some of it lighter to show that the tiles are uneven. Maybe some is higher, some is lower. And as a result, the ones that's higher is going to cast a deeper shadow and darker shadow as well. So even here. So variety really is the key to making your line weight feel much more elegant rather than it feeling clumsy and heavy. Let's have a check. Looking good. And I think the key to learning in general is to try and isolate your variables a little bit. As I mentioned, line weight can represent a bunch of different things, and today we've covered 3 of them. And there's many more things you can choose to emphasize, of course. But these are definitely the main ones that I notice with artists. And rather than overwhelming yourself with all of it at once when you're a beginner, just try to focus on one of it. If your main focus is underside for now, maybe after finishing the door over here, and once again, adding variety to show that the planks that make up the door have different depths. And even with these little shapes as well, with the bolts here, even under the door. Maybe some here as well. Not all of it. Maybe some of it is quite shallow. Here as well. Underside. And even here. Even here as well. Yeah, if your main focus right now is underside, you might call this done. And let's just turn this on and off. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. And I'll label this as underside just so that we can see how it looks like when we continue to build it up. So next could be depth. In this case, since it's technically one object, we can still emphasize, for example, this part of the wood that sticks out more. Technically, this is the object closest to us. So maybe this part is going to receive a bit of emphasis, just a bit. I don't want it to be too obvious, but you can see as I turn it on and off, you can see a difference. This also might be a little bit closer than this door, so I might emphasize it a touch. Even here as well. Maybe here as well. Just to show that it's a little bit more forward than the wall behind it. And even with the door, maybe to distinguish it from this frame in the back, I'm gonna emphasize it a little bit here. And sometimes you can think about emphasis as a bit of double lining just to make the lines a little bit thicker, that's all. And here, because this is in front of the door, it's gonna receive a bit of treatment. But as you get further and further away, there's less emphasis. I wouldn't say none at all, but maybe just a touch here and a touch here as well. Just to create a bit of that transition. Because right now there's such a big obvious difference between this line and here, but maybe to just make it feel a bit more gentle, I'm gonna cause it to like taper off a little bit before it goes into something really thin. So even just something like that can help. Oh, and here, just to distinguish itself from the one in the back. And sometimes, hey, it helps to just say things out loud, just to reason with yourself or really try and internalize what decisions you're making. It's too easy, especially when you're starting off, to mindlessly do it. But I promise you though, as you guys do more and more of this, the easier and more automatic it'll be. Maybe some of these tiles in the front, just a few. I'm not gonna do too many, because otherwise maybe I'm gonna be bringing too much attention to the tiles. And to distinguish this in front of the chimney, you can see the emphasis being made here as well. Maybe a little bit here, because this part is closer to us than this. So I'm gonna make this a little bit deeper. Just a little bit tapering. Oh, and I forgot the underside here as well. And you don't have to do it all in different layers, but at least for learning, I do recommend it a little bit, just to help you be very mindful about what you're doing. But later on, you can honestly just do everything all on one layer. But I do like to save previous versions just in case, you know, just in case. Yeah, making this stand out a little bit more. As you can see, with the depth, turning it on and off, it's more subtle. But once again, it's creating a little bit more distinction between certain elements. Maybe even here as well. And lastly, to emphasize the quality of the forms, form quality. So maybe I'll make this part extra sharp. And maybe this part as well, a bit sharper. A little bit here as well. Since there's not too much rounded objects, I can't really emphasize the roundedness too much. But maybe here, I can always make it a bit rounder and deeper. Yeah, this one's probably not one piece that has too much that I can play around with for roundness emphasis. Maybe here, a little bit. Make it, or actually here, just so we accompany it a little bit with the shadow as well. And lastly, deep shadow. If you want to, this is the optional part that maybe you can think about. Oh, a deep shadow that's being created by the roof that's overhanging. You can do it this way. And notice how the brush size gets bigger too, compared to the more subtle and smaller shapes that I was doing. So yeah, some of you guys might be freaking out. It's like, oh, Jordan, it looked better before. Well, yeah, maybe for you, but I like it this way, right? So definitely think about your own preferences as well. Maybe I'll do this so that I can just easily do this. Sometimes if your line work is closed and you set your magic wand tool to select all layers, you can just do this. But unfortunately, I did not do that, so I might have to just manually do it like so. Yeah, line work honestly can be very, very relaxing. This is usually the stage where I'd hop on a call with friends or watch video or something, listen to music and just chill. Yeah, I've I love line work though. It's definitely my favorite thing to do. And I feel like sometimes this, what's a shame is that I like to do line work so much that when I actually start trying to paint the piece, it just feels like there's a bit of a clash where the line work style doesn't really gel with the painting. So I feel like I just want to, you know, cut my cake and eat it too, or however the saying goes, where I want the best of both worlds. I want to paint and do line work. But sometimes this super heavy graphic style doesn't always suit painting as well. Usually you see simpler and flatter colors because in a way, if you think about it, if you're already putting so much emphasis and work into the painting, that when you're also doing a painting style that's also just as complex, or something that actually has a lot of contrast, should I say, then it begins to clash with one another. So I might emphasize the line weight here a little bit more. And maybe even under here too. Yeah, and there we go. So what I'll do now is just group these together and turn it on and off. And you can see the difference. So yeah, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this line weight tutorial. And if you have any more questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Alternatively, you can drop some of your favorite line work artists in the comment section so you can share it with other people. And be sure to let me know of future video ideas. I love to hear from you guys. And until the next one, guys, take care. And as always, stay stretchy.